This series of 3 is going to look at the nature of relationships through the Sephirotic system. I want to give a little overview of the previous sessions so we can have context, and that way understand why the 3 Sefirot that we're going to be looking at, Netzach, Hod and Yesod, are the Sefirot of relationship, and what do we mean by relationship. So let's go back to first base. And that is the use of words to describe things that are ultimately indescribable. Now, when we speak about the nature of creation, there's no capacity of a finite human mind to be able to reach into there and even have even the smallest sense of what the processes were all about. And in truth, we would not know anything about that, other than that the Torah, and the Torah is the blueprint of creation. We have a midrash that tells us that Hashem wanted, desired to create a world, and thereby looked into the Torah to provide the guidelines. Now, of course, that is a little bit nonsensical, because obviously the Torah is a product and God is the antithesis to that. Nevertheless, that midrash speaks in context of giving us a sense. So that when I say that the Torah is a blueprint of creation, I mean that the shape of the letters, the juxtaposition of the letters, the undervowels, the musical notations, the crowns on the letters, all these are part of a very complex code that provides us with some insight into the nature of reality. If, for example, you were to find yourself walking in the wilds of New Guinea and happen to be an architect, and you had under your arm an unfurled scroll, and some local native stopped you and said, "Could I see what's there?" And you opened the scroll, and actually it was an architectural drawings, and he would ask you, "Well, what is this?" And the response by the architect would be, "Well, this is a drawing of a 21-story building." To which the native would say, "Certainly not. All I can see is lines and squiggles on paper, no 21-story building whatsoever." And of course, both are correct. The lines and the squiggles, etc., are basically markings on paper. At the same time, if we understand the code that's encoded within there, and you happen to be learned in the subject, you'd probably recognize something about the nature of a 21-story building. Likewise, the Torah. The Torah is a narrative. It provides some semblance of history, but it's not a history book. There are plenty of areas of history that are not notated at all within. It's a book of philosophy. It's a book of instruction of lifestyle. It's a book that teaches the relativity of values and the like. It's many, many things. And it's got a way of reading it. So that if I look at a particular phrase and I give it to a Shakespearean scholar to interpret it, and then I give it to a constitutional lawyer to interpret it, both will interpret that phrase differently and both will be correct. Therefore, we have within the domain of the Torah itself 13 rules of interpretation which the Jewish constitutional lawyers, so to speak, are able to utilize in order to draw the information. Furthermore, the Torah as a blueprint possesses 4 layers. And indeed, in the next series, Menachem is going to lead us through a consideration of the 4 worlds that corresponds to these 4 layers. And the 4 layers are the ostensible meaning of the text, translative value, what the words convey, is called pshat, plain meaning, narrative. But however, beneath there lies a deeper level of understanding, so that, for example, if I were to be the bearer of, God forbid, sad news to you, I would probably not choose to blurt it out, but rather what I would do is I'd probably hint at the information to provide an emotional climate that could accept and receive the information in a softer way. In other words, there's a level of hint or allusion also in the words of the Torah, and that level is known as a remez. Then there is an even more profound level in understanding and interpreting the Torah, and that level, known as drush, is when the information is so difficult, so confusing, so complex, whatever I might want to convey to you in whatever context, that all I could do possibly is hide the information in an allegory, in an analogy, in a story, maybe even in a nigun, a song, and in so doing convey something of the essence of what's even more profound. So the main work of drush is a work called the Midrash, which some of you will have heard of. And if you read the Midrash, it reads like quaint anecdotal stories rather than profound wisdom. Rest assured that beneath the surface there lies very profound wisdom. And then there's a fourth level, a level known as Sod. That level of Sod is where reality is abstracted into forces and energies and mathematical constructs and all the things that are the building blocks of the nature of creation as such. And that's identified with Kabbalah, from the Hebrew word lekabel, which means to receive. So the student received the teaching from the master, because this was taught as an oral tradition, master to student. The verb lekabel, to receive, the noun Kabbalah. So the word Kabbalah means the process of receiving the fourth and deepest level. So in these discussions we have here around the table, we're actually talking in terms of the fourth level. But if you were to open works of Kabbalah like the Zohar or Sefer HaYetzirah, they would sound awfully cryptic and really beyond any sensibility, because one has to learn the methodology and the coding and the like, let alone the Aramaic language. Therefore, it's fortunately in the 18th century, Hasidism came onto the scene, and part of the schooling of Hasidism was to take the cryptic teachings of Kabbalah and make them understandable. Therefore, in these sessions, we employ the Hasidic teachings of Kabbalah to explicate the information that we're trying to convey to you. So, having said that, I come back to my first question. How can we even begin to use language to describe something which is beyond the finity of mind? The brain is 4 inches by 5 inches by 6 inches. I'm still an inches man. Therefore, it's got shape, it's got design, and anything that's got shape or design must, by definition, be finite and limited. That means there must be something beyond the brain's comprehension. So in humility, we have to know that. Imagination, which is a gift that God created within us, is probably the most spiritual mechanism that we have to touch aspects of infinity. So in our imagination, we can actually conjure up images that defy the laws of nature. Now, how we are able to do that, you say, oh, that's imagination. But no, it means there's something very, very special about an aspect of ourselves that allows us to even conjure that up. We can fly, we can defy gravity, an elephant can pass through the eye of a needle. Anything can happen in imagination. So we also utilize imaginative extensions of words to understand a little bit of the depth within. This is usually called anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism means applying to God human terminology. God by definition, creator by definition, the infinite source by definition, is beyond our mental attributes, our capacities to understand. However, through the use of anthropomorphisms, we attribute to God human-like qualities so we can have a connection. So as we're studying the Sefirot themselves are a language of description of the Godhead and the way it operates in the world of here and now. So when I use human terminology and descriptions to describe aspects of the cosmos and beyond, remember, all I'm doing is approximations that allow us to have a hint of something that's totally beyond the word and beyond our understanding, but nevertheless is true in the hands of a Torah teacher, a good Torah teacher. Because a good Torah teacher would not be making anything up from his or her own volition, but through the Masorah, through the tradition of the use of words that Moses first initiated on coming down from Mount Sinai, and therefore spoke the accuracy of what took place there. Okay, this is by way of beginning introduction to today. Get a sense of that? Now, there are metaphors that we use, as well as anthropomorphisms. As I said before, there's the use of allegory, analogy, and metaphor when something becomes too complex. And two primary metaphors that are used to describe the nature of reality is the light metaphor and the humanoid metaphor. So, let me speak about the humanoid metaphor first. It's rather interesting. In other words, we can describe the cosmos, the whole nature of creation, in the same shape and form of a human being. So God possesses a left arm, a right arm, a left thigh, a right thigh, a mind, a heart, etc., etc. Anthropomorphisms. But metaphorically, they convey something of an abstract essence that gives rise to mind or gives rise to emotion. So there is spiritual abstract mind. There is spiritual abstract emotion. So those of you who were here for the first 3 sessions of this series would have had 3 sessions that Moshe gave in context of the mind aspects of the humanoid metaphor. And we discussed there Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at, the 3 processes of cogitation. Chokhmah, giving birth to thoughts, or conjuring up a cogent thought from the subconscious. The Chokhmah mechanism allows us to cross the boundary of subconsciousness to consciousness, and the word subconsciousness is simply a Western psychological term that really, in our own spiritual teachings, it's much more developed than a term, subconscious. Then we have Bina, which is taking that initial kernel of thought, the seed of thought, and allows it to progress, to move, to flow, thought flow in direction, in breadth, etc. And then there's the third aspect of the mind cogitative ability, and that is da'at, and that means focusing. So you have the birth of something, its evolution and development, realizing understanding, and ultimately da'at, the concentrative faculty that gets it to a goal, to a point, whatever it might be. And we apply those 3 steps across the board in all our thought processes. Up there, well, there's no really up there, it's everywhere. There is Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at, spiritual forces, Sefirot, which also make up the nature of an intelligent cosmos. Okay, and of course we study that in context of the subject matter. Then we spent 3 more sessions, and then we spoke in terms of the 3 Sefirot of emotion, Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferet, and Menachem led those 3 sessions. And we learnt there that we have, as far as internal emotions are concerned, 2 equal and opposite tendencies, Chesed, which means the flow outward, and Gevurah, which is the retention within. And rather than describe them in terms of normative emotions, we discuss them in terms of directions. Anything which flows outwards emotionally, sharing, giving, contributing, etc., is an aspect of chesed. Anything which is constrained, limited, focused, flexed, like in muscle flexing, is an aspect of Gevurah. And literally Gevurah means strength, and literally Chesed means loving kindness. So these equal polar tendencies, which every human being possesses, tear us in two different directions. Therefore comes the third Saphira of Tiferet that reconciles them into a cogent singular emotion at any one time. So you really have a feeling at a time. How does Tiferet do that? Apart from its innate capacity to be able to take the two, Chesed and Gevurah, and bring them together, also the three of mind provide the compass or the direction for that. So there you have a situation where we have three internal emotions, Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferet, creating a feeling. It'd be interesting to try to discuss the difference in the English language between the word feeling and emotion. But the problem of discussing anything of ultimate reality in the English language is that English is a very poor language to discuss anything of higher reality. Because English is a bastard language, right? It's made up of Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, Roman, Greek, Romance languages, classical languages, and the like, and therefore you've got all sorts of overlaps of words and shades and shades. It's not an exact language. Whereas, as we will see or have seen, Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, is a highly exact language which actually describes the nature of reality. So it'd be much better if we were conversing in Hebrew here. But if we did, I suspect that many of you might not turn up, and therefore it's of not practical value as such. So we now have a mind-directed emotion, wise or unwise, depending if the mind was wise in its conclusion in terms of Chachma Bina Dat or unwise. You can have unwise feelings and wise feelings, okay? And therefore it might be sometimes perceived to be very wise to be highly compassionate, and in fact it might be very unwise. For example...
What comes first? The mind or the emotion?
The mind.
The mind.
Mind.
So whatever... that's going to lead to the emotion.
Correct. But to give emotions a compass bearing so that they have a flow in a direction which we would like to choose to be intelligent, emotional intelligence, we first have to be able to master the mind, and even before that, apply the mind. Very often, we're not masterful enough even to apply the mind, so the default mind, which is usually will then operate in microsecond, will then dictate the feeling. Someone's yelling and screaming at us. The microsecond of an untrained mind will say, hey, you're being emotionally abused, attacked, yell back. Now, the masterful mind will recognize that when anyone's yelling or screaming, it means they're in pain, and rather than yelling back, we should assist them and not suffer emotional abuse simply by being truly compassionate. That's how you don't suffer emotional abuse, by not becoming a victim of it. So you have to reinterpret. You have to apply the mind. The mind has to provide a compass bearing and say emotions flow like this, outward rather than ego-centered inward in that particular instance, etc. Yes, but by definition, even when people say, oh, she or he only acts emotionally, all that means is that emotion is highly dominant in the equation of mind input and emotion input. Okay? All right, so now we get to the three that we're going to be talking about over 3 sessions, and that is, what do you do with this mind-directed emotion? You have a feeling. I mean, you don't spend life just enjoying feelings. In fact, it would be terribly, terribly boring. I mean, there's only so much time that you can laugh to yourself or cry to yourself, etc. At the end of the day, where does fulfillment truly lie? In the expression of feelings in context of relationship. Unless there is a relationship per se, then we would be very, very lonely individuals. And that's what loneliness basically is. The lack of the capacity of allowing our soul to touch another soul, the lack of the capacity of the emotions to express. So we have 3 Sefirot now, called Netzach, Hod and Yesod, which we're going to encounter. And they're going to be the 3 of relationship. But before I get stuck into them, let me just speak about the nature of a human being. Because why are we studying this material? Admittedly, it might be simple curiosity to understand the nature of the world or Jewish perspective on spirituality, because I've studied all about Buddhism and now it's time for me to study my Judaism, whatever might be the particular incentive. But what we want to do is to be able to understand in context of the Torah, what is the primary motivation of human endeavour? Because if we can answer that question, we can understand why the design of the cosmos actually is as it is. Because there is design and there is purpose, and we are that purpose. Now that's not being egotistic in saying that, it just happens to be a fact. How do we know that? We know that from the Sefer Yetzirah, which is the formative book of Kabbalah in terms of chronology and time, which Abraham compiled, where it's got this cryptic statement, the end is wedged in the beginning, and the beginning is wedged in the end. And if you were to read that in the Sefer Yetzirah, in its translative format, you would say, wow, that's profound, that's deep. And I haven't got the faintest idea what it's talking about. So that's why we need Chassidus to extrapolate and make it intelligible. So what we understand is the foremost kernel of thought, what gave birth to it, has the ultimate purpose of what the thought process would lead to. So say you have a vision for your dream home. You have a vision for your dream home, wherever that was conjured up from, okay? But it was a vision. At the end of a multi-stage process whereby you employed an architect and he used or she used draftspersons, and then the plans were submitted to the town planning committee where they were rejected, of course, because they have to earn their living also, and ultimately were passed with some minor detail change or whatever might be the case. And then you got the construction company to come on site and excavate and build and process, etc., and the bricklayers, and then you have the finishing trades coming in, and you have the colours put on the wall and what have you. What happens at the end? At the end is your original vision. And in your original vision, you envision the end. The end is wedged in the beginning, and the beginning is wedged in the end. Now it becomes a little more intelligible. God has a vision, wakes up one night and says, I have a vision for reality, whatever that might be, consciousness, whatever that might be. Therefore takes his, its, hers, don't know how to describe God, drafts angels, and they begin the process of drafting. And then the Midrash tells us that even God has to submit plans to the local angelic town planning permit committee, and the Midrash gives us a stenographic recording of the proceedings there, and they don't like it, they don't want to pass it. And the Midrash tells us that the members around the town planning committee say, God, you must be kidding. You're going to create human beings, fallible, making gross errors, messing things up. Stick with us, we're a better bet. But you know how stubborn God can be, and he pushes the plans through town planning, and we have 7 days of creation. What was the last thing created? Us, fallible human beings like me that keep making mistakes. But since we know that was the last item of creation, that must have been the foremost vision at the inception. The end is wedged in the beginning, beginning is wedged in the end. So despite ourselves, we are the purpose. Why are we the purpose? To be co-creators of an unfinished universe. In other words, God wanted relationship, if I can put it anthropomorphically. And we are God's relationship. And we enter into this enterprise, and everything that we do by way of thought, speech and behavior, impacting the world, impacting each other, is part of that construction process, the ongoing construction process, for reasons that we will never know. This is the desire. Where does desire come from? If you want to analyze what the word desire or wish or want is, it'd be very hard. Is it the same as emotion? When you want something, is that the same thing as I feel something? Not really. Is it I think something, I want something? Not really. It's beyond both of those. So desire comes and from a higher place, a spherical keter that we didn't touch. But it comes from that higher place. And therefore, the wantingness in a human being is an extension of the wantingness of God in terms of creation. So if we can understand what we really want, then we can really understand what God really wants. So that was speaking in terms of the humanoid metaphor, that we can look at the human being with all our attributes, whether they be mental, emotional, whether they be physical. And in so doing, we have a sense of what the nature of the cosmos is. Indeed, the Beit HaMikdash, the temple itself, also was a microcosm of the macrocosmos. And those who study aspects of the construction of the temple, the nature of the temple, will recognize that the humanoid metaphor applies to a description of the construction of the Beit HaMikdash and its nature, and coincides with the nature of the cosmos at large. So that's a much bigger exercise, which I'm not sure we're going to enter into here. So that's one metaphor. Then there's another metaphor that we use called the light metaphor. In other words, we try to describe the processes that God initiated in terms of the nature of light, because light has many of these abstract qualities which lend themselves to discussion of mystical and spiritual phenomena. What is light? We're not quite sure. Sure, it's photons, but what are photons made up of? And it's light energy or is light matter? And all these imponderables, of course, ultimately all energy and matter is interchangeable. And we learn in Chassidus that all spiritual energy and finite energy is interchangeable also. So it goes on ad infinitum.
What's finite energy?
Finite energy is measurable energy, and infinite would be non-measurable, presumably. Okay? Or spiritual might be non-measurable. To measure something, you need to have instrumentation. So we have instrumentation that can measure physical phenomena to a point, like we've never really seen an atom, believe it or not. We've seen molecules, they're big enough to be able to see under electron microscope, but not atoms. But the fact of their existence is mathematically predicted. So they serve a model construct that they exist, etc., in terms of electrons, protons, neutrons, and smaller particles, and onwards and onwards. Okay, so we've got the light metaphor, which also helps us, and we'll be employing that to speak in terms of the nature of the cosmos as such. So, coming back to the basic question. What is the primary motivation of human endeavour? What makes you tick? What makes you get up in the morning and move through the day? So, in contemporary psychology, they've come up with all sorts of possibilities. Freud said libido drive, that's what drives us. Comes along Adler, and he says, no, Mr. Freud, you're wrong. It's a quest for control and power. If you have control and power, then you feel safe, and that's what you seek in life. Comes along Maslow and says, gentlemen, you're both incorrect. It's a hierarchical model of food, clothing, shelter, ultimately self-actualization. And on it goes and on it goes. And one of the things that I readily learnt in university when doing my master's in psychology is that everyone's arguing with everybody, and there ain't any real answer. In the Jewish spiritual teachings, we note that the primary motivation of human endeavour is cryptically described as taking all the twos of life and creating ones. Resolving dualities. Firstly, look at ourselves. We're made up of twos. Rather strangely, have you ever asked yourself why we have two hands and not three or one? We have two eyes, why not three or one? We have two nostrils, we have two lips, we have two legs, we have two hemispheres of the brain. Strangely, everything comes in dualities, and our perception of reality comes in dualities, right? Because we understand and recognize things as up, down, left, right, positive, negative, particle, wave, yin, yang. Everything comes in twos. I mean, the laws of probability will tell us it's highly unlikely. Even in evolutionary notions, which I don't accept, but even there, it's highly unlikely. And of course, the answer lies because the whole purpose of creation is for the human being to resolve dualities and create unities. Echad. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. To create a state of oneness. The most powerful mechanism that we employ that works in terms of the greatest human motivation is called love. Love is the most motivating factor that drives a human being. And I'm not going to now discuss, for example, Viktor Frankl's writings in terms of logotherapy, but I certainly would suggest that you do read his wonderful book, Man's Search for Meaning, in which he evolves the notion that what happened he was a Holocaust survivor as a psychiatrist, and in his book he notes how people behaved in the camps and the discrepancies and some of the enigmas that plagued him in terms of their behavior and the like. And he concluded after the war that the most dominant motivational force that drives us is to bridge the distance between me and you. And that's why relationship is the quest, to take two and create one. And we do that. We come closer and closer and closer, appropriately, in different relational contexts, and in the most intimate relational context of, say, husband and wife, a peak experience takes place. But even that peak experience of absolute oneness of mind, heart, and body dissipates, and one separates again from intimacy because our capacity to maintain oneness in a world of duality is not possible other than momentarily. So life is a spiral where we engage in trying to re-engage the peak experience, whether it be through the mind, whether it be through the heart, whether it be through the body, or all three in unison and the like. And in different propriety of relationships, that's what we achieve. Parent and child, within the propriety of that loving relationship, seeks its peak moments. Friendship, even with a stranger. There are proprieties that need to be able to be maintained, yet there's a quest of engagement. So the three Sefirot that we're going to be talking about in context of these 3 weeks are the components that make up the nature of relationship formation. And we're going to do it from not a Western psychological vantage point, but from a Hasidic Jewish spiritual perspective. And then you can take it away and do what you like with it in terms of understanding it. Ultimately, the way that we can actually merge is quite fantastic, because here you are with a different genetic makeup, with a different environmental processing. Me again different. How do we actually bond? So again, if you take the analogy of if you were to wish to join two surfaces of two different materials, you would use a binder of some kind. Say you're a sculptor and you're using different materials in order to connect the various elements, and they're made up of different materials. How would you do that? You'd have to find a binder that has properties of both and more in order to be able to create the oneness. The and more is the operative thing. And therefore, likewise, in our quest for loving each other or entering into endearing, compassionate, warm relationships with each other, it's insufficient that our individual desires simply create the reality. There has to be a third component that binds it. And that third component is the third partner in life. We attribute that to God for want of any better understanding. So we say in all loving relationships, there's always a third partner involved. So that's the connection aspect. Fulfillment and happiness are expressions of oneing, creating oneness. Ask yourself, in recent times, when were you felt a moment of ecstasy, a moment of great joy and happiness. Just cast your mind back. When was the last time that you might have experienced that? Today, yesterday, a month ago, a year ago, 10 years ago, whatever might be the case. And I have no doubt, no matter what you will find or offer, it will have been a moment of relationship. It will have involved another, and highly likely in context of an act of giving and contribution to the other. So these are fundamentals that we're talking about in context of the nature of relationship. And I want to build up a model over this week and the next 2 sessions of how we can actually master skills that create worthwhile, meaningful relationships by focusing on these 3 Sefirot. Now, having said that, of course, they don't operate divorced from the other 6 that you have discussed. In other words, at all stages, Chochmah, Binah, and Da'at operate. At all stages, there is mind consciousness. If that is mastered, it becomes mindfulness. Then you have emotion awareness. And if mind is able to sculpt emotion appropriately, then you have an emotion that is intelligent. And then comes our step, how do you translate that into a way that 2 become 1? Relationship. Any questions or thoughts thus far?
Can I just ask, when you're
Sure.
talking about memory of happiness or fulfillment, that would include relationship, a sense of relating to God, and or an aspect of oneself that's one that you've reconciled, or something has gone together and you've
Absolutely.
been illuminated in some way?
You make a very good point. I'll repeat that because it's a point that needs discussion. Your name?
Sarah.
Sarah said that relationship also is more than simply me and you. It may well be me and me. It may be me and a circumstance. For example, how do I relate to information? The closer I relate to it, the more I can say I know. To know something is the peak experience of a relationship with information. Very few people can say they know anything. Because when you ultimately analyze what knowing is that it's a part of you. So if I were to ask you, what is 7 times 6? And you said 42, and you answered 42 instantaneously, it's because you know it. You didn't even have to process it. It's a part of you, whether it was drilled into you in the old-fashioned way of times tables, which we're now learning is definitely the best way, because we're now discovering through brain scanning techniques what happens when you repeat something by way of practice, not unlike learning to play the piano. You have to keep practicing. And now we learn in spiritual mastery, the more that you can change automaton habitual responses into mindfulness responses, what you're doing is changing the neurotransmittic pattern of flow in the brain, specifically in the prefrontal cortex, and that is only achieved by repetition. So don't knock the old-fashioned times table drill that created that knowing. But knowing in Hebrew is actually the word that describes the third of the mind processes, da'at. Do you know when the first occasion in the Chumash that the verb lada'at, to know, appears? It's quaintly in the instance of Adam knowing Eve. Adam yada et Chava, and Adam knew Eve. And isn't that quaint, the way the Torah, the Chumash speaks? I mean, why use that kind of a euphemism? Why not say straight out, and Adam had sexual relations with Eve? It's because the way that we use the word sexual relations is only one dimension of creating oneness. a physical dimension. When we're talking about true knowing, it's multidimensional. To know something means you are it. It becomes you. So all three aspects of consciousness have to be present within. To know means there's no distance between you and it. 42, no distance. To truly love someone, there's no distance. I remember a cute little story of a chassid who came to the Lubavitcher Rebbe and spoke extensively about how he was helping an individual spiritually with tefillin and Shabbos and kashrus and everything else. And the Rebbe stopped him and said, "Tell me, do you know his economic circumstances? Do you know his financial circumstances?" "No." "In that case, you don't really love him." Don't think that spirituality is the singular mechanism of creating connection. To know someone means I have to anticipate your needs before you even express them. That's really the test of knowingness, the test of proximity, the test of closeness. Okay? So coming back to your question, yeah, we enter into relationships of wanting across the board with nature, with the vegetational world. Even through the act of consumption, of eating, we enter into relationship with the food, or we should. Of course, if we exploit the food, for example, emotional eating or gluttony, escapism on the one hand and egocentrism on the other hand, then what you're doing is you're entering into a very perverse relationship with the food. You have to honor the food. Here we're not going to discuss what the Jewish spiritual teaching is on how to honor the food and how to enter in states of relationship with the animal world. The Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, says that you have to feed your pet before you sit down to the table and eat. You're not allowed to sit and eat unless you feed your pet first. Or milk the cow first. Whatever the circumstance might be. And likewise, our relationship ecologically or with the inanimate world. We're not allowed to wantonly destroy anything. Wantonly destroy anything. I think I mentioned the story of the Friedricher Rebbe, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, was walking with his father in the forest, and they were discussing deep philosophical notions, and the younger, who was to become the Friedricher Rebbe, as he was walking, idly picked a leaf off a tree. And father stops him and says, "Do you realize what you have done, taking the life of that leaf?" In other words, relationship is across the board. It's a holistic approach to the nature of living. So your point is a very valid one. Any other questions at this point? Yes?
You described the English language as being a poor descriptive language.
Yes.
The word relationship which you use, what is the Hebrew of that? And
okay, so the Hebrew word is yachas. The modern contemporary Hebrew word is yachas. And yachas has the first two letters, yud and chet, of the word yichud, or achdut, oneness. And therefore the word relationship directly relates to the idea of bridging the distance and creating oneness. That's where Hebrew has it all over English and other languages. Anything else before we actually get tangibly into these three Sefirot? Sefirot are abstract emanations from a source, which in this instance happens to be Creator. The word Saphira, which etymologically is the antecedent to the English word sapphire. There's a lot of words in many languages that clearly are derivatives of the original mother tongue, which we believe was Lashon HaKodesh, the Hebrew. So you can find many words that have direct correlations to the Hebrew. And because of Sapphire's fiery appearance of giving forth light, the word Saphira is applied in context of describing these fiery emanations, so to speak. Fiery in their impact rather than in their appearance as such. But then the word Saphira has the shoresh, the root samech fe resh. And you'll find other words in Hebrew that have that root, but in English seem to have a different meaning as well as their use in Hebrew. So, for example, lispor, to count, is the same word as Saphira. Because counting is a mystical number, numerology is a mystical way of approaching the nature of reality, in fact. We're not going to go into numerology here. But it's one of the bases of the creation of a world of pirud, separation. Everything in this world is in a state of separation. When Menachem takes the next series of the four worlds, he will explain that the lowest realm of Asiyah, where we exist, where our consciousness exists, is the world of pirud, of ultimate separation. There are things, there are molecules, there are people, everything's in a state of separation, deliberately to get to that state of unity, as we spoke previously. So you have counting as an aspect of Saphira. Then there's Sipur, which means a story, a tale. What could that possibly have in terms of its connection? So note that in Jewish literature, historically, the use of fiction didn't exist. Here we are, the oldest extant civilization in the history of the world, sitting around this table. You and I are 3,500 years old. There's no other culture that has cultural continuity for that period of time. None, I assure you. And nevertheless, having said that, when we're talking in terms of Jewish literature, writing, the use of fiction and novel doesn't exist. Parable does, but parable's purposeful to relate to reality. Why is that? It's rather interesting. Because what is the purpose of a novel? The purpose of a novel is to be able to provide one person's vantage point of reality. No one in Jewish history, until much more contemporary times of the last 2 centuries, dared put into writing his or her personal vantage point of the nature of reality based on the shortness of 120 years of life, which is just far too short. So all the writings that have ever existed have always been writings that surrounded the Torah itself. It's interesting. It's only the use of the novel as a Jewish mechanism only arose very recently as assimilation took place and the like. So again, but why does the word? Because in the fable, Sipur, intentionally you provide the underlying meaning that you want to get across, which the ostensible narrative can't do so. So again, Sefirot provide for us a model that convey an essence of what it is, how Hashem operates in the world of here and now. So all these connotations of the word Sefirot come together in context of our discussion of these flows.
What about the word sphere? Is the same how?
Absolutely, no question whatsoever. It comes from the Greek spheros, which in turn came from the Hebrew samach peresh. Yeah. Okay. So, and there are different ways of combining these Sefirot to describe reality. So you have 10 Sefirot basically, right? Chochmah, Bin and Dat, Chesed, Gevur and Tiferet, which we've studied, Netzach, Hod and Yesod, which we're going to study, and Malchut as well. And these 10 Sefirot are sometimes combined in different ways to describe the nature of reality, and these are called profiles, or the original paratsuf, or paratsufim in the Hebrew. Paratsuf, paratsufim are profiles. So when I was speaking in terms of our mind profile, I spoke of only 3 of the Sefirot, etc. We're going to speak about masculinity and femininity in context of the Sefirot. Because masculinity and femininity are relative terms. everything possesses both masculinity and femininity, and that's part of duality. Now, some things are more masculine, some things are more feminine. The Godhead is both masculine and feminine. The feminine side of the Godhead is called Shekhinah. And we're going to, when we study the last of the 10 Sefirot Malchut, we'll be talking about the Shekhinah as such.
What was Godhead?
That means Hashem, that stuff which is God, okay, which is no real word. So they like to say Godhead. It's like up there compared to down there. Okay, so masculine femininity. So Chochmah is masculine relative to Binah. Okay. On the other hand, the 9 Sefirot are masculine relative to the lowest one, Malchut, which is feminine. Lowest not in quality, as we'll see, but in its particular role. Bringing things right down to the reality, which is the intention of creation, etc.
Classify as being...
Men are masculine and feminine. Women are masculine and feminine.
No, but the Chochmah and Binah, how do you classify that as feminine or masculine?
In their functionality vis-a-vis each other. So, for example, Chochmah is or Binah is the nurturing agent that allows the flow of initiative of Chochmah to be expanded and grown into the child, which is the thought. There are ways that the Kabbalah speaks in terms of that. Okay? So we have these relative. When I said we are both in terms of men and women, masculine and feminine. So sometimes men need to call on their more feminine side in order to be appropriate in the way that the resolution of any situation might take place. And sometimes women have to call on their more masculine side, etc., which means call on their more masculine characteristics, or we would say spiritually, the masculine sephirotic capacities that they possess. So that's always in a balance. Some men tend to be more effeminate than other men. Some women tend to be more masculine than other women. So there's a continuous gradation in terms of that, and it's a flow, etc. Ideally, the way it is that nevertheless femininity dominates in a woman, masculinity dominates in a man, and you've got to have both in order to merge. If we didn't have the properties of each other, we wouldn't have absolute merger. To have absolute merger, I must have what you have, and you must have what I have. So that's another dimension of it, and that's called paratsufim, the kind of profiles of the Sefirot in terms of whatever we might be discussing. Speak now, forever hold your peace. Have I bamboozled you?
Yes, just a little.
I'll tell you something that the Lubavitcher Rebbe once told me personally in a private audience. I had the merit of having 7 audiences privately with the Rebbe, and in one of them he gave me advice on giving classes or lecturing, and he said, make sure that when you speak, everyone walks away knowing there's much more to learn. Have I succeeded? So he also said speak one notch above the audience for that very same reason, I assume, etc. But that's not the reason. The reason is because the information that we're studying is relatively strange to us, having raised in a Western perception of reality. And we don't yet have the full language of commonality to discuss this. There's a technical language of application to discuss the subject matter and the like, and we don't have that together. So I struggle, it's me who's struggling, not you, I'm struggling to be able to enter beneath the veneer of your minds and hearts and try to get certain information across. If, as a consequence of our session, you walk away confused because the information is either overload or obscure, then probably I've succeeded to some extent, all right? But that isn't my intention, please understand. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop at this point and save the beginning of the discussion of Netzach, Hod and Yesod, but just to provide a bit of tantalizing introduction, Netzach means the thrust of courage crossing the interpersonal boundary. how I will open my mouth and speak to you rather than remain silent and not speak to you. Hod is the capacity of restraining the flow of words or the nature of the words so they're pitched at the right level. So whereas Netzach is an effusive chesed-like tendency, I reach out to you verbally, physically, whatever might be the case. Hod is I restrain myself so that the level of what I want to convey is absorbable by the recipient. So Hod restrains. And we'll see Yesod does two things. Yesod is the mechanism of reconciling that into a propriety of the moment of expression. And we'll see that's also the source of bonding between two people that leads to absolute commitment in an ideal relationship. So that's what we're going to hold off for next week.